You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Hello, my name is Arman Özildirim, Senior Director for Economic Research at the Conference Board, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Indications podcast, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I will be sitting down with my colleagues Chuck Mitchell, who is the Conference Board's Executive Director for Content and Quality, and Ilaria Maselli, who is the Senior Economist for Europe, to discuss our special mid-year edition of the C-Suite Challenge survey, looking at the COVID-19 recovery. What is next? Today, we will focus on the results for Europe from a global perspective. But first, about this COVID-19 edition of the C-Suite Challenge survey. With the outbreak of the pandemic in early 2020, the Conference Board decided to follow up the annual C-Suite Challenge survey published in January 2020 with a special COVID-19 survey focused on the timing of an economic recovery and the long-term impacts business executives see as the likely legacy of the pandemic. A total of 1,316 C-suite executives, including 606 CEOs, participated in the special anonymous survey fielded in June 2020. First, let's start with the headline results. We have been living for 6 months with the pandemic, and there's no sign it's fading away. We're all thinking about long-term changes that can arise as a result. We want to know what's on CEOs' minds in this respect. Our first question is to Chuck. What are the most important long-term effects that CEOs expect for their company's operations?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And I think that's a great question. You know, what CEOs and C-suite executives see is really kind of opportunity to transform their organizations, and they're transforming it into digitally driven enterprises. They'll be leaner, they'll be more agile. It's really about accelerating digital transformation and remaking business models. And they also see a long-term change in consumer behavior. I think the pandemic and the lockdowns have forced consumers to look at different ways to buy and different things, different products and services to buy. And you know, this business model transformation, I think, is a critical part. It's not just what they sell, but how they sell things. It's the whole notion of adding servitization to a physical product. And they see a long-term opportunity to cut strategic costs, too. And that's everything from a decrease in permanent staff to office space to business travel. And they're redefining how work gets done. They're looking at creating agile project teams, which reinforces that acceleration of digital transformation.
Thanks, Chuck. So it seems like the pandemic really changed the world literally overnight and created all these disruptions and changes. Ilaria, what do the European CEOs think about this? Do they differ?
Yes and no. So I don't know if Chuck agrees with my interpretation of the results for Europe, but what I see in the numbers is that the digital transformation is really the center of the attention also for European CEOs and C-suite executives. But my feeling is that in their mind, this is more on looking at the consumers rather than looking at the way we do things. Because if you look at the results, we see that the rethinking of business models ranks lower than elsewhere, whereas there is a lot of attention towards the consumer. And in fact, European C-suite executives are more convinced than their peers elsewhere that consumers, for example, will be more willing to pay more for locally produced brands. So I think this is one distinct point when it comes to Europeans. As anyone else, there is, of course, attention to cutting costs. There is no surprise there. We know that cash is really the key to surviving in this month. So on that, I would say that we are all on the same page.
Interesting. Let's look at the future of work as we learned from the survey. So everyone is wondering what the world of work will look like in the future. What do we learn about it from the survey? Chuck?
Yeah. So indeed, you know, I think a lot of it harks back to the notion of digital transformation. I mean, CEOs are looking really to build leaner, more agile teams. And it's creating more of a focus in organizations on employee well-being, not just the physical well-being, but the mental health. There's a commitment from CEOs and organizations to to look at the employee more holistically, as you will, coming out of the pandemics, and it's going to create a lot of challenges, especially in the HR space. I think managers are going to have to get better at leading remote and virtual teams, and it's really about connecting remote employees to the corporate vision. It's setting a clear direction and expectations. And we know that some members are even creating a virtual team work contract to maintain standards and make clear and clearly defined boundaries. So, and there's going to be challenges around innovation. Innovation is always about it takes a village, and in an office setting, and when people are in that office, there's a lot more sharing, a lot more informal idea exchanges. And there's another issue about onboarding new employees. The remote work whole aspect of it now continues to work because people had existing relationships. And then when they went remote, well, they knew their colleagues. But as new people come on board and into organizations, and they haven't had that physical face-to-face, it becomes challenging to make them engage them as part of those teams. So, I think that those are real issues that are going to challenge organizations as throughout this pandemic and even in the post-pandemic period.
Yeah. Chuck, did you find that there were differences among the members of the C-suite, for example, CEOs versus their CHROs, or do they all see in the same way?
There's basically general alignment on the key issues, but one thing that really did stand out was that CEOs had very highly ranked. In fact, it was number 4 that they were looking at decreasing the permanent workforce and using contingent labor, temporary workers more frequently as a result of the long-term impact of the pandemic. But the HR space and the other C-suite had that much lower on their radar, and I think that maybe there's a little disconnect about the pressure that the existing workforces are under. CEOs see this as that opportunity to cut the long-term costs, but the rest of the C-suite is saying kind of, whoa, wait a minute, guys. We're stretched. We're cut to the bone now. We're stretched as thin as we can go. And I think that whole long, big strategic direction as to who's doing the work in the organization is going to require a lot of conversation.
Of course, it's still early days. We're only into 6th or 7th month of the pandemic, and these conversations are just beginning. So it'll be interesting to see where the debates will land. Let's turn to Ilaria and ask about Europe. What's the future of work in Europe?
Well, I think it's not too different from the future work elsewhere, in the sense that a lot of the things that Chuck said apply here as well. But if looking at the result, there is really one thing that attracted my attention, and that's the interest in hiring a bigger number, a bigger share of workers remotely on a permanent basis. Now, it attracted my attention because we know from research from colleagues in the US that there's been a change there happening already in the last 5-6 years. So we know from data in the US that there is an increasing share of people that work remotely on a permanent basis. And now we start to see that there is interest here as well. Now, unfortunately, I don't have data to compare that, but there is a lot of thinking going on, and we know that's relatively easy to do in the US because if you are a company in a state A, you can hire a person in state B relatively easily. But now that we talk about it in Europe, it's clearly more difficult to do that because if you're a company, say in Belgium, and you want to hire somebody in Greece on a permanent remote basis, it's really not so easy. But yet, I hear a lot of talking about this, and especially from sectors where there is a shortage of workers, there is a shortage of skills. I'm thinking especially of the pharmaceutical sector, where you need a very technical profile. You really need to hire. You really have to keep your market broad in order to find the right people. So I wrote about this recently in an op-ed in the EU Observer, because what is really emerging in Europe is the fact that it's not easy with 27 different legislations in the EU only to facilitate remote working on a permanent basis. So what would be needed would be some sort of additional contract, let's say a European contract on top of the national contract, where you target really the mobile workers and allow for this type of agreements that reflect the technology and the way we work today.
I think, Laura, I think those are good points, and I think one of the big debates that's going to surface is this whole notion around productivity of the remote workforce. I think some of the luster of everyone's much more productive when they're at home. I think that's starting to fade, and we've done some work in the human capital space, some surveys that showed that indeed the increased productivity of remote workers is a bit of a myth. The shine is off that. At best, it's neutral. They're as productive as they were in the office, but there's about a third in a recent survey of HR executives here in the U.S. that found that they felt that productivity was decreasing. So I think that's a debate too that is or something that needs to be monitored by organizations going forward. The whole notion around productivity of a remote workforce.
Yeah, of course, it depends on the type of work you're doing as well. So, remote work, working from home, is more suitable for some types of occupations, in the white collar occupations, rather than some others, in the industrial or manufacturing sector.
Yeah, and I think the Europeans have an advantage here in that, at least when it comes to reopening of schools, here in the U.S., for example. The stress that it puts on workers trying to, if you will, homeschool their kids and do a full-time job is really proving incredibly stressful for a lot of people.
We've been there, but now schools are opening gradually, and it's been 2 weeks in Belgium actually, and today they start in Italy, and in country by country schools are opening again. So fingers crossed that things go well, especially for working parents that really suffered during the lockdown.
And the ability to tap into your workforce that's working from anywhere in the world really opens up new possibilities too that companies can take advantage of in terms of finding the best talent. So I think we'll be looking at this issue for some time to come. But I think this is a good time to take a short break. We'll be right back after the announcements to continue our conversation on the special mid-year edition of the C-Suite Challenge survey of the Conference Board.
Looking for additional business insights in this subject area and beyond this podcast? Go to tcb.org/EU and explore our Economy, Strategy and Finance Centre. Uncover a large array of products hosted by the Conference Board in focus areas like global economy, labour markets and many others. Products include peer-to-peer networking events, expert briefings, publications, data and analysis, webcasts, videos and blogs.
Welcome back to Indications Podcast, where we're talking about the special mid-year edition of the C-Suite Challenge survey, looking at the COVID-19 recovery, what's next. I'm joined by my colleagues Chuck Mitchell and Ilaria Masele in the studio. Next, we're going to talk about some of the implications in terms of geography. There's a lot of discussion about, with the advent of remote working, does this spell an end to cities and city centers where offices are concentrated? So first, let me go to my colleague Chuck. Is the end of cities overhyped?
I think it is overhyped to some extent. Cities are resilient. We've seen, say for example, New York's bounce back after 9/11. That this may be more a temporary reaction. I mean, we're seeing certainly impact on real estate prices and office space availability, at least in the short term. But there's so much vibrance around cities that the short-term reality that fewer people, tourists are coming in center cities. They're not shopping, they're not being entertained, but we're social creatures by nature, and I think maybe a vaccine, in a sense, when that becomes available in a year's time or so, changes the dynamic again, and you get back to the cities revive, again, being social creatures. So much of a person's individual identity in life revolves around that office, right? It's their social contact, not only their work contact. And if again, it's just, offices located in cities, I'm one thinking that there's going to be a comeback. And only about a third of C-suite executives and CEOs believe that the long-term impact of the pandemic will be that the importance of cities will decrease. So it's not an overwhelming majority that feel this will be a long-term impact. I think they kind of side on the notion that cities will bounce back.
So it doesn't sound like CEOs are convinced that they're ready to withdraw from cities and move their operations or offices to, outside the cities. And those are long-term decisions, and they're not to be taken very lightly. So they're not quite ready to take those decisions. But what about in Europe? Is the view different, Ilaria?
Well, not really, because the responses of European C-suite executives were very much in line with the global average. So about a third agreeing that COVID is a bit the end of cities. So again, not an overwhelming majority at all. I think the big hit for European cities is really the tourism. I've seen horrible numbers of occupancy rate of hotels this summer, and they were in the range of 10-20% in European capitals. So I think the big hit for European cities has really been the summer season, the missed summer season. But otherwise, I would agree that the debate, this is overhyped. Also because a lot of this debate is dominated by American commentators and not so many Europeans one. And we should keep in mind that European cities are different in the sense that taking aside London and Paris, that are really big cities, most European cities and most European capitals are actually much smaller than many American cities. And I think the size matters here because a lot of the issues with COVID are, for example, related to public transport and commuting time, and this applies a little bit less to the smaller European cities.
Yes, indeed. And tourism is a very important sector that creates a lot of income and value for many European countries. So that is a major impact as a result of this. Now, switching gears a little bit, besides COVID-19, there is a lot happening in the world that's creating disruptions lately. And that makes me wonder, what is the place of companies within societies? What is the role of the corporate mission? Does COVID-19 change anything for many of these businesses?
I think it's causing a big rethink on how a corporation views itself and its contributions to society. Now, about 2/3 of respondents really believe that the pandemic will force a change in corporate mission, that there will be this notion of management for all stakeholders, not just shareholders. And it has to do, I think some of it has to do with accelerating what was already in place was the focus on sustainability of the business in the long run, not necessarily the environmental side of sustainability, but just whether your business is going to be around in 50 years time. And there's a realization that new generations in the workplace are going to expect more from their employers. And that was already a process that, at least in the U.S. and I think Europe and probably many other places in the world, were already ahead of this. But it's accelerating that look at the corporate mission and the corporate's role in society and the corporate role in change, in fomenting change. So, again, CEOs are they're looking inward and saying, hey, we have to do something different. There's a lot of circumstances. The expectations of our employees and our customers are all changing. And it's really going to, I think it's going to change the whole view that corporations are going to get ahead of things when it comes to speaking out on social change because their customers and their employees and the other stakeholders demand it.
So they're really looking at these topics very seriously, and it's become much more top of mind compared to recent years. And how about the view from Europe, Ilaria?
I think this is even more felt here than elsewhere, because if I look at the question on what is the place of companies, whether they should benefit society in a broader sense, it's 71% of CEOs in Europe that agreed with that, compared to 2/3 of CEOs globally. So this is very much felt here. I think it's really at the core of the European model, of bringing society together. But I think this is one of the trends that was not created by COVID, but was accelerated by COVID. Because when I was preparing for this podcast, for our conversation, I went to check when was it that Business Roundtable changed the statement on the role of the corporation. And it was actually a little bit more than a year ago. It was just August 2019. So I found that kind of funny because, it was the thinking was there already, but the hardship of COVID and the big economic and societal challenge created by the pandemic are really accelerating this and hopefully bringing society together.
Thanks, Ilaria. Before we close the podcast, there's one more topic that we asked about in our special mid-year survey of the C-Suite Challenge. And that was about the ongoing trend that was already there about globalization. And some go as far as to say the world is becoming deglobalized. And we wonder whether these trends might be reinforced by the pandemic. Do you think that the pandemic is resulting in a rethinking of globalization as a result of what you saw in the survey? What do CEOs think?
Chuck? Yeah, I mean that's I think an important question. But what we have to realize, a lot of people, when you think of deglobalization, you think of it purely in trade terms, and globalization is multidimensional. I mean, it's about financial flows, it's about immigration, digital flows, exchanges of ideas. When it comes to trade, we already, in some of the work that Ilaria did, showed that deglobalization, at least of supply chains, the onshoring, reshoring of intermediate goods, was already a trend in place. And in the minds of CEOs, especially in the U.S., where about half see the long-term effect of COVID-19 as being a further deglobalization. So it's, there's this trend in trade where it was already in place and being accelerated. Now it's being accelerated by COVID-19. But, I think that because of that multidimensional aspect of globalization, that it's hard to shut off that tap. Everyone is so interdependent now on all sorts of issues, from collaboration externally across borders to employees across borders to the whole multinational aspect of many organizations, that deglobalization may not necessarily increase, but I see it as kind of more at worst place it stays where it is, right? So that's the notion. Even though, as I say, the U.S. CEOs have seen a more deglobalized world, but I think that's a reflection of the current administration in Washington and the whole aspect, its view of everything from bilateral to, as opposed to multilateral trade agreements, those sort of things. So their view, I think there's some concern about supply chain security and extension, but it's not the biggest part of this notion. So I think it's a very good question.
Thanks, Chuck. And in Europe, of course, in a way, the economy is much more globally integrated through trade relationships and as well as other relationships in financial markets and so on. But they're also faced with things like Brexit. And what about, globalization and rethinking globalization in Europe, Ilaria?
I think what emerges from the result of the survey on this topic, which of course is one of the most interesting topics ever, is the fact that we are in some sort of phase of transition. And I agree with Chuck that whenever we think of globalization, we are actually thinking about trade. But even in that case, what my perception is that there is on the one end this silent localization of supply chain that is happening. There was no shocker on that. We show in this Going Local report that Chuck mentioned that it actually started in 2012, so many years ago, and very gradual, no shock there. So there is that happening under the surface. Then on the other hand, of course, there is everything that is related to COVID and trade wars and conflicts with China. So all of that is, of course, fueling the perception that the world will deglobalize in the next years. But then when I look at there is a question in the survey on operations and what are the priority exposed by COVID on operations. There is a question on reorganizing and localizing further supply chains, and that is not a priority. So there is some sort of disconnect between the perception of what is going on and what you read in the media every day on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the fact that there is no concrete strategic reorganization happening as a reaction to that, because companies, CEOs, and executives don't think that localizing and reorganizing supply chains is really a priority. So in the full ranking of about 15 options, it ranks number 11 globally, and it's a little bit higher in China, where it's number 8, and in Europe, where it's number 9. But still, this is far from being a priority among the long-term impact of COVID-19.
Thank you, Ilaria. I think there will be some long-term impacts on many dimensions as a result of this global pandemic, and we'll be monitoring that and talking about that in the years to come. Of course, there's much more in the survey and the report that we won't be able to cover here, but it is time to end this podcast. I want to thank my colleagues at the conference board, Chuck Mitchell and Ilaria Maselli, for joining this podcast. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Ilaria. And I also want to thank our listeners for their attention. And you can download the report at www.conference-board.org. And if you enjoy this episode, remember to subscribe to our Indicators podcast series, or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website. Thank you.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.